Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man tabi'ahum bi isanin ila yawmiddin wa ba'd. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu taqullaha haqqa tuqatihi wa la tamutunna illa wa antum muslimun. My dear brothers and sisters in Islam, last week, if you remember, I mentioned to you, I reminded you that the state of New Jersey has declared January to be Muslim Heritage Month, with the aim that our greater community of the state come together to acknowledge and hopefully appreciate the many contributions that the Muslim community of this country have made to our collective society. And I asked a question about what from our heritage would you want people to remember most, and my suggestion or hope was that they would clearly see that we are people who are devoted to our faith like no other people in this state. And that we live a life not for this world, but for what lies in store in the next. And because of that, we have the resolve and the courage needed to fight for justice, to fight for truth. And in the process, we would end up elevating everyone else along with us in this life. Sometimes when you look at the principles of Islam, the teachings of our religion when it comes to things like bravery and courage, which is largely based in the trust and reliance upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you look at the examples of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam and his great companions, you look at the heroes of our faith. Oftentimes we're thinking, well, that's back then. Today's very different. It's hard to embody such a spirit in modern times. And so I wanted to offer a perspective as a follow-up to the points that I mentioned last week. I think it's very important for us to highlight a real-life American Muslim example of these very qualities, the qualities of courage and resolve. And of course, while many of you know this long weekend is in observation of Martin Luther King Jr. Day, I personally cannot think of anyone more courageous and resolute, at least not in our modern American history, from the Muslim community than the well-known civil rights leader Malcolm X. Malcolm X, also known as Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, he was a man of humble beginnings. He had a troubled past. He grew up in a time when racial tensions in this country were reaching a peak and was a first-hand witness to the racism, bigotry, and injustice that communities of color faced in America. As a child, his parents were outspoken activists. He came from a household of activism. They were highly involved with the UNIA and admirers of Marcus Garvey. The UNIA, by the way, was considered to be the most influential anti-colonial organization in Jamaica, which was Marcus Garvey's home prior to 1938. So this was where they came from as a family. And because of that activism for communities of color, for African American rights in this country, they were seen by the Ku Klux Klan. You should be familiar with that group. And the Black Legion. This was another white supremacist group during the time. Malcolm X's family was considered to be troublemakers and were subject to harassment and threatened many times. And this led them to relocate from where they lived. Malcolm's father even accused the Black Legion of burning down their family home in 1929. And it would only take several years after that for him to pass away. Malcolm's father was said to have been killed by his mother, murdered by the Black Legion. So after surviving a rather traumatic childhood, Malcolm led a life of crime in his early years and ended up in prison. And it's there in prison that he joined the Nation of Islam, which was a black nationalist movement. He began to educate himself within the confines of his prison cell. And after his release, he was rapidly promoted within the Nation of Islam. And he opened up temples for the Muslim Brotherhood from the nation in Boston, right here in Philadelphia, and in Harlem. And at that point in his career, he was now under surveillance by the FBI, because at that time the FBI were hunting down communists. And I mentioned to this before. And he was seen as a potential communist, and so he was under surveillance. His work with the Nation of Islam expanded into New York, into Harlem, and he garnered the attention of the New York City Police Department. They also put him under surveillance, saying that he was a man that had too much power within that community. Eventually, Malcolm X would become disillusioned with the Nation of Islam. He found that it was a very rigid organization, very difficult to navigate the issues of civil rights in this country while associated with them. And he was also made aware of their leaders' immoral behavior. And so he left the organization. But that didn't sway him or stop him from his work in civil rights. He continued his mission. And he even expanded it, expanding his approach to being one of more involving human rights as opposed to civil rights in America. And that was this time that he converted to Sunni Islam. Not only disenfranchised with the organization of Nation of Islam, but was now becoming aware of their false doctrine. He made Hajj. He went to Mecca. He was hosted by, at the time, Prince Faisal as a state guest. And he made subsequent visits to Africa, where he met with many leaders. He gave interviews, and he spoke on both radio and television in Egypt, Tanganyika, which is today's Tanzania, Nigeria, Ghana, Guinea, Sudan, Senegal, Liberia, Algeria, and Morocco. And he was offered positions, government positions, by many of those countries that he visited. He became a champion of international causes. Not only championing the cause, but was critical of the United States' involvement in some of those causes, like the massacre of many of the Congolese by their own leader. Their leader was being supported by the United States, killing the people of that country. And he was a staunch critic of Zionism, as well as the Israeli occupation of Palestine. In September of 1964, this was just months before his assassination, he published an article in the Egyptian Gazette entitled Zionist Logic. And I'm going to share some of that article with you today. I think that it's extremely pertinent as a Muslim American, as an icon of our Muslim heritage, and his position that he took on what seems to be extremely relevant right now today, back in the 60s. And this was before Israel was officially acknowledged as a state. He said that the Zionist armies that now occupy Palestine claim their ancient Jewish prophets predicted that in the last days of this world, their own God would raise them up a Messiah who would lead them to the promised land. And they would set up their own divine government in this newly gained land. This divine government would enable them to rule all other nations with a rod of iron. He said if the Israeli Zionists believe their present occupation of Arab Palestine is the fulfillment of predictions made by their Jewish prophets, then they also religiously believe that Israel must fulfill its divine mission to rule all other nations with rods of iron, which only means a different form of iron-like rule, more firmly entrenched even than that of the former European colonial powers. These Israeli Zionists religiously believe that their Jewish God has chosen them to replace the outdated European colonialism. You have to understand that this time is when many of the countries in Africa were breaking free of their colonial masters and declaring independence. And now he's saying that they're going to take over that colonialism. And many of you are familiar with that and the sheer brutality that was or that defined that period, especially in Africa. So this is a new form of colonialism. He says it is so well disguised that it will enable them to deceive the African masses into submitting willingly to their divine authority and guidance without the African masses being aware that they are still colonized. The Israeli Zionists are convinced that they have successfully camouflaged their own kind of colonialism. He says their colonialism appears to be more benevolent, more philanthropic, a system with which they rule simply by getting their potential victims to accept their friendly offers of economic aid and other tempting gifts that they dangle in front of their newly independent African nations whose economies are experiencing great difficulties. During the 19th century, when the masses here in Africa were largely illiterate, he said it was easy for the European imperialists to rule them with force and fear. But in this present era of enlightenment, the African masses are awakening, and it is impossible to hold them in check now with the antiquated methods of the 19th century. They could no longer use brute force against the countries in Africa. He says the imperialists, therefore, have been compelled to devise new methods. Since they can no longer force or frighten the masses into submission, they must devise modern methods that will enable them to maneuver the African masses into willing submission. Think about that at that time and what's happening in the Arab world today when it comes to willing submission. He said the modern 20th century weapon of neo-imperialism is called dollarism. The Zionists have mastered the science of dollarism, which is the ability to come posing as a friend and benefactor, bearing gifts and all other forms of economic aid and offers of technological assistance. It says, thus the power of influence of Zionist Israel in many of the newly independent African nations has fast become even more unshakable than that of the 18th century European colonialist. And this new kind of Zionist colonialism differs only in form and method, but never in motive and objective. He said at the close of the 19th century, when European imperialists wisely foresaw that the awakening masses of Africa would not submit to their old method of ruling through force and fears, these ever-scheming imperialists had to create a new weapon and to find a new base for that weapon. Of course, we know where that is today. The number one weapon of 20th century imperialism is Zionist dollarism. And one of the main bases of this weapon is Zionist Israel. He said the ever-scheming European imperialists wisely placed Israel where she could geographically divide the Arab world, infiltrate, and sow the seed of dissension among African leaders, and also divide the Africans against the Asians, talking about the Arabs. To divide the two. Zionist Israel's occupation of Arab Palestine has forced the Arab world to waste billions of precious dollars on armaments, making it impossible for these newly independent Arab nations to concentrate on strengthening their economies of their own countries and elevate the living standard of their people. And the continued low standard of living in the Arab world has been skillfully used by the Zionist propagandists to make it appear to the Africans and the Arab leaders that they are not, to the Africans, that the Arab leaders are not intellectually or technically qualified to lift the standard of living of their people, thus indirectly inducing Africans to turn away from the Arabs and towards the Israelis for teachers and technical assistance. He said, they cripple the bird's wing and then condemn it for not flying as fast as they are. Brothers and sisters, he says in closing, in short, the Zionist argument to justify Israel's present occupation of Arab Palestine has no intelligent or legal basis in history, not even in their own religion. This was in 1964, September. This was 5 months before he was assassinated. He was under constant surveillance. He was considered an enemy of the state. And throughout that year, he received repeated threats on his life from the Nation of Islam. Imagine for a moment, this is what we're talking about, the courage and the bravery that it takes to stand up at times for justice and for truth. Imagine the bravery that it took for him to be that outspoken during that time. That time, September 1964, you know the Civil Rights Act was only passed in July of 1964, that very year. He was standing up for human rights back when the black community was still being lynched in the thousands. And I believe that this is a part of our American Muslim history that must be honored and celebrated not only in this month, but in the many months to come. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين من كل ذنب فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. بسم الله والحمد لله حمدا كثيرا طيبا مباركا فيه كما يحب ربنا ويرضى ونصلي ونسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما. Brothers and sisters, when you look at the life of Malcolm X, when you look at the courage that he displayed in the face of adversity, you find that it mirrors the Quranic concept and teachings on sabr, on patience and perseverance. In Islam, our faith teaches us that patience is not passive acceptance. To be patient doesn't mean you passively accept what's happening to you, especially when you're wronged, but it is an active resistance against injustice, active perseverance and resistance. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَمْ حَسِبَتُمْ أَن تَدْخُلُوا الْجَنَّةَ وَلَمَّا يَعْلَمِ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا مِنْكُمْ وَيَعْلَمَ الصَّابِرِينَ. Do you think that you will enter paradise, into Jannah, without Allah knowing those of you who fought in His cause and knowing those who are patient? This is Surah Al-Imran, chapter 3, verse number 142. Do you think that you will just passively sit and accept? Or are you going to be active and resolute in fighting for truth and justice? The Prophet and his companions, they certainly had to endure their fair share of abuse from their oppressors. But that's not all. They didn't just sit back and take the abuse. When the time was right, they were commanded to act. They had to engage, to actively resist against the injustices that were not only being committed against them, but were being committed against every other innocent and weak person in that region. And the cost they had to pay, it was their comfort, sometimes their wealth, and at times it was their lives. Brothers and sisters, Malcolm X exemplified this by enduring personal hardships while advocating for change. And his legacy continues, and it should continue to inspire each and every one of us in this community and our Muslim communities around this country and around the world to fearlessly stand up against injustice, irrespective of personal or societal pressures. Brothers and sisters, it's not time to be timid. It's not time to be shy. We did that already. We were timid and we were shy. And you know where it got us? Nowhere. You know what it got us? Nothing. We have to be willing to speak out and to stand up. And so we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to increase our bravery, to bless us with courage, to grant us the ability to speak out and to stand up against injustice, irrespective of personal or societal pressures, and to be champions of positive change. اللهم يسر ولا تعسر وتمم بالخير وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين.